What's going on YouTube? We're back at it for another video. Today we've got the Spirit Nuke build for Necromancer. Now you may have noticed more than a few people basically making some builds that are combining Bone Spirit, Bone Spear, and Bone Splinters, you know, all the BS's from the Necro. Gets a little bit tongue twisty, but effectively what I wanted to do this season was just focus purely on Bone Spirit. I wanted to see whether or not I could make it a whole build where Bone Spirit was the main DPS. We do have Bone Splinters with this build at the same time, just to kind of compensate in some moments to gain that essence back and be able to give us a little bit more of that critical strike chance from some of the moments we may be hitting 3 of those splinters. We'll talk about that once we get into the skill tree though. But effectively, from about level 35 to 40, I transitioned away from utilizing Bone Spear with the Bone Spirit, as you will need to utilize both at the very beginning before you've kind of fleshed out your skill tree in order to level. But around that time, I completely eliminated Bone Spear, and from that point all the way through the end game, I have been doing just fine, even on just basic craftable, imprinted legendary aspects early on. Before I even made it into tier 4, I was able to make it through the tier 4 capstone and into tier 4 relatively easily, and it may not have been on that Hoda level where it's one-shotting things, but it certainly was just blowing away pretty much everything that I had before me, and up to the point that we have it now. Still, yet again, sadly enough, Barbarians are really just leading the way this season, but no doubt this one's going to be just behind them. It's going to be enough damage to basically clear any of that end game content. I've been farming Duriel, sadly enough no uber uniques just yet, but at the same time, the only thing that's given me trouble with this build is effectively either a moment when I don't get a critical hit, which can be frustrating, but it doesn't end the actual build itself. A lot of survivability built into this, but ultimately, Uber Lilith and Uber Malthus with their one-shot capability moves are about the only thing that I've truly had issues with. The damage with just Bone Spirit has been phenomenal, and I have had no issues with essence regain either, as even at certain points, we have enough essence with this build where even casting it at about half of our maximum essence is still dishing out millions of damage. But that being said, we've got more than a few things to cover, so let's jump into the gear. And when it comes to the gear, I'm going to run through this pretty quickly. We're going to basically go through each one of these slots, showcase the legendary aspects and a couple of the key aspects you want to roll on each piece of gear, and then I'll come back after that to kind of key highlight some of the ways you can get certain pieces of these gear. That way, you know, you basically guarantee yourself a way to build it out or build your Necro out just like this, or give you some of those keynotes on what you should use while leveling before you find some of these pieces of gear, and what you can do to trade off certain aspects as you're leveling in order to make it to the point where you get to this Spirit Nuke level, even though it will always be a Spirit Nuke, even with some lower level gear, even in just yellows sometimes. But that being said, we'll start off with the helmet. We've got the Embalmer aspect on this one, so every time I'm consuming a corpse, I have the possibility of spawning a Blood Orb. The 2 roles that we want on this are going to be maximum essence and cooldown reduction. Up next, we've got our Blood Artisan's Cuirass, however you'd like to say it. Effectively, what we're looking for with this unique is going to be that Bone Spirit. Always want to have that maxed out. By the time we get this upgraded by level 5, we'll have 4 points to Bone Spirit. And at the same time, anytime we're consuming Blood Spirit or Blood Orbs, we're going to have free Bone Spirits out of that. Coming up next on our gloves, we've got the Edge Masters, which is just going to fully give us an additional possible 20% increase to our maximum damage output from having maximum essence, or slightly less than that, depending on how low we are in essence whenever we cast. The main thing we're going to be looking for on gloves is hopefully a max roll of critical strike chance. You really want that 12%. It's just going to help us out a ton later on. And the rest of it would be critical strike damage or intelligence. Those things are going to be really beneficial for us on gloves. Coming up next, we've got Temerity, which is going to be super beneficial for us, as every time that we're healing over 100% from a potion or possibly from Blood Orbs, we're going to have a barrier that hopefully for you is going to be an 80% of your maximum life. Sadly enough, I haven't been able to get that, but at the same time, we're getting maximum life on top of this from just having these pants, just increasing our overall survivability. Coming up next with our boots, we've got Exploiters, which is going to further increase our crowd control duration by 20% and give us a little bit more of that stopping power when it comes to unstoppable enemies. The 2 things that we want on boots to roll are going to be movement speed and plus ranks to Bone Spirit. Highest ranks, 3 on minimum drop, until we upgrade this to level 5 from the blacksmith, then we get that additional 1 for the plus 4. Moving on to our weapon, you are going to want a two-handed sword for this. That way, every single time, not only are we going to have the maximum capability of our Swelling Curse aspect, but at the same time, it gives us a guaranteed critical strike damage increase every time that this drops. And the number one thing that we want to look for is increase to intelligence at the utmost. You know, that huge increase, especially if you can get a max roll on that, is going to be huge for our increase to just damage output no matter what. But at the same time, getting critical strike damage, vulnerable damage, crowd control damage, damage to stunned are all things you want to be looking for when it comes to that two-handed sword. Now, with the aspect of the Swelling Curse, hopefully you get that max roll pretty early on, because trust me, getting that 50% increase to critical strike chance with Bone Spirit is a huge benefit to you, and at the same time, it gives us the capability of increasing our maximum essence for every enemy hit. Not just every enemy killed, every enemy hit by that blast radius of that Bone Spirit is going to increase our maximum essence by 2 for 15 seconds, which is going to be huge for us. That is plenty of time, even with the slowest person, of getting that essence back up to maximum. Is really just going to give us that overall damage increase that we need. Now, heading over to our amulet, I am working with serrations over here. You know, with ossified essence, we are further increasing our critical strike damage with bone skills for every point of essence past 50 up to a maximum of, sadly enough, 60%. I wish they wouldn't cap this. I wish this would just go all the way through the roof to whatever maximum essence point we were at. It would be really nice. But at the same time, the number one thing that we're going to be looking forward to roll on the necklace is going to be +3 increase or +2 increase ranks to Macabre skills, which is going to further increase the ranks for our Blood Mist, our Bone Prison, and most importantly, giving us the maximum increase that we can get so far with Bone Spirit ranks, which is going to be, I believe, 16. Beyond that, we're going to need basically Harlequin Helmet, which is, you know, just one of those in-game things that you just farm out, or the unique stone for the Schnitzel lap crab that we have, the little construct that gives us another plus, I believe, 4 or 2 ranks to that, which would be really nice. But those are things that are just, you know, additionally going to make us a little bit more powerful. It's not going to be something you absolutely need to make this build absolutely devastating, but you want those +2 to Macabre skills, and then once you upgrade that 5 times at the jeweler, you'll have that additional +1 for that +3 ranks. Now, coming up next, when it comes to rings, the 2 things you want to roll on each ring, hopefully you get, is going to be maximum essence and critical strike chance. If you can get both of those maxed out, the other 2 that, you know, you have, or the other 2 aspects that you roll on there, you know, critical strike damage, physical damage, damage to stun, damage to injured, any of those are just going to be beneficial for you, damage to vulnerable. But the 2 number one things that you want are going to be critical strike chance and maximum essence. Now, on the first ring, I have Shattered Spirit. This is the new Bone Spirit aspect that we've got that's going to be sending out 18 bone splinters in a circular radius around us every time that we launch Bone Spirit. And each time one of these hits, we're going to be getting 6 essence back every time. This is really beneficial for just gaining that essence back every time that we're using Bone Spirit, getting us ready for, after those 2 seconds of cooldown, if it critically strikes, to have that next Bone Spirit ready to go with pretty much maximum damage already. Now, the 400% increased damage isn't that great. You know, it can be noticeable in certain times. It can take out some of those weaker enemies at certain points if it critically strikes itself, so it can be nice. But in situations where you're facing off with something like Pestilence, the world boss, if you're right underneath him, every single one of those bone splinters hits, and you get all of that 18 times 6 right back into your essence, which is really nice, and you're just ready to roll with another heavy hitting nuke from that spirit. Now, up next, we've got the Grasping Banes on the next ring, which is just going to further increase our capability of having a higher critical strike chance, and on top of that, increasing our critical strike damage towards that enemy hit by Corpse Tendrils. On top of that, Corpse Tendrils is just going to pull everything together within that blast radius. That way we can group everybody together, especially in dungeons, and just really heavy hit with that critical nuke. It is going to be devastating. Now, on that note, you know, that's all the legendary aspects and a couple of the key highlight aspects you really want on that. I will key highlight that cooldown reduction. You know, you're not always going to get that max roll when it comes to your helmet. If you possibly have one of those moments where it's not that high, you can't re-roll it, but you have a good high maximum essence on this, try to roll over to your necklace and try to find cooldown reduction on that. Honestly, 10% cooldown reduction, if you can just hit that bar, that little ceiling, you're going to be just fine, as that's going to be the minimum you need in order to make sure that every time you cast Bone Spirit and it critically strikes, it's going to cut it down to a 2-second cooldown. That is going to be huge for us. It's just going to overall increase our capability of dishing out that DPS and just increasing our survivability, as we'll be able to just constantly be popping out more bone spirits to clear the area in front of us. But that being said, you know, anything beyond 10%, like if you already had 10% on the helmet and then you got another 10% on, I guess, the necklace, I can't remember if that can actually roll 10%. It honestly isn't going to be the biggest difference. You know, you may possibly get somewhere close to it being maybe possibly 1 second, but I would assume you would need an offhand to even get that close with all that cooldown reduction, and it's just not going to be hugely beneficial with you. At one point, I was utilizing the 10% cooldown reduction with another cooldown reduction amount on my amulet, and honestly, it was probably like 0.50 of the seconds right here, and it just wasn't a huge enough difference, so I ended up just re-rolling with something better for my necklace, where it just overall increased my maximum damage output or increased my survivability. Now, when it comes to the Blood Artisans, if you don't have this already and you don't know where to find this, we're about to showcase where you can find this, but at the same time, while you're leveling, if you haven't made it into tier 4 yet, do not even worry. No matter what the legendary chest plate, even yellow chest plate that you may be using, as long as it's close to what your level is and it has a good decent amount of armor on it, you're more than likely going to be fine. It doesn't matter what the legendary aspect is. It doesn't even matter what the stats are in general. They may affect your bone spirit in a slight way, like physical damage or bone skill damage, or all stats. Just increasing your intelligence might be a little bit of a benefit to increasing your damage just slightly, but it is not going to be something that is going to be on the level of the Blood Artisans. It's just going to be something that creates a little bit of survivability and gets you enough to make it through to the tier 4 zone before getting that unique chest plate that's really going to amplify the damage. Any chest plate's going to do, though, so don't even worry about it before you find the Blood Artisans. Now, when it comes to farming the Blood Artisans, once you get into tier 4, what you're going to need to do is head over to Helltides, and within Helltides there is going to be a golden chest that is adjacent to that of the mystery chest for living steel. Now, living steel is a consumable that we'll need 5 of in order to head over to the Hall of the Penitent to face off with the Uber Boss Grigor, which has the drop rate for getting that Blood Artisans. The one I am wearing right now is the one I got from Grigor, and best bet, if you're early on in tier 4, you're not very leveled, at level 58 I walked into tier 4 and my armor was not, and gear was just not ready for it. The damage was all there, but survivability was kind of low. You may want to just end up throwing a couple of topazes into your gem sockets. That way you've got maximum lightning resistance, and then on the third socket put in a skull for a bit more armor. That's going to be your best bet at facing off with him, considering pretty much every attack he deals is going to be lightning. Now, he is one of those iron giants, so there is still a physical, he's got a large mace to swing and a large radius, which can be frustrating, and he does kind of kite you into corners, push you into close in moments, so you're going to have to kind of work around that. Blood Mist is definitely going to be a huge help with that fight, but overall, you should be able to get that Blood Artisans fairly quickly, and don't even trip about whatever the amount of blood orbs is that you need when it gets the drop. As long as it has that +3 to bone spirit on it, that's your good to go moment, because later on, after you have that Blood Artisans, especially if you upgrade it to level 5 and you have it +4, you're going to be getting to the point where you two-shot Grigor. It's going to be no issues whatsoever. You're going to be able to farm him out up until the point that you find a Blood Artisans with that low amount of blood orbs at 5 and the +4. You'll notice I still don't even have one with maximum life at its max roll. I'm still kind of looking for that. It would be a little bit of a benefit, but at the same time, the only two things you're really worrying about, or the number one thing you're really worried about, is just getting those max ranks to Bone Spirit. That's all the damage we're going to need to really clear out the end game. The blood orbs, getting the free Bone Spirit, is something that just makes us a bit more efficient when it comes to farming out dungeons and clearing things a bit faster when it comes to just AoE damage, and just being able to just farm that out, considering Corpse Tendrils is basically going to be the main way that we're getting blood orbs out of this build. Now, when it comes to pants, honestly, if you don't have this one drop, don't even worry about it. This is something that's just going to further increase our survivability. No doubt you will more than likely find this as you are leveling, or even after you find the Blood Artisans as you're going through into the end game. This is not an end-all be-all. You can use any type of pants that just give you a little bit more damage reduction. Ranks to Bone Prison might be a little bit beneficial, but anything that's just going to give you damage reduction or possibly a bit more survivability, and legendary aspects that give you more survivability, such as that of Might, where we're using basic skills. Since we're still using Bone Splinters, this is more damage reduction for us. You know, Juggernaut's giving us a bit more armor at the cost of evade, cooldown, and at the same time, something like Disobedience would be great as well, just further increasing our overall survivability with just maxing out our percentage of armor that we have available to us. And also, if there is another unique that you could possibly use, which is the Tacits of the Dawning Sky, which gives us a bit more survivability, a bit more resistance to elements, and on top of that, another 10% increase to resistance to certain elements that we have been affected by, and more maximum life, which is more damage bonus to our free bone spirits that we do have later on. I'm telling you, I keep having this moment where I'm thinking about Bone Spear, Bone Splinter, all the BS's of this build. It's like a dyslexia nightmare for me every single time. But that being said, you know, any pants are going to do if you don't have temerity that have just some type of damage reduction, just giving you that overall survivability. When it comes to your boots, Exploiters is nice for just increasing a little bit of that damage, but if you're looking for a bit more mobility, if you're feeling like, man, I'm just a little bit too slow, even if you have a max roll and movement speed, something like the Wind Striker is also going to be fantastic for you, since we are critically striking. And not only, you know, you may think to yourself, oh, for 1 second, up to 6 seconds, you know, Bone Spirit's a single target critical strike. It's an AoE critical strike, so every time that it's critically striking everything around it at the same point. So you're going to be hitting that 6 seconds pretty regularly. So if you're really looking for a bit more mobility, Wind Strikers might be the option to go with when it comes to your boots if you really wanted to. You know, play around with some of these. I'd argue at the same time, Shattered Spirit, it may be getting me essence back, but it's not overall increasing my overall DPS output. There could be some other aspects that you could throw in here that could give you a little bit more damage, or possibly more essence regeneration, especially since something like, I forget the name out there is, I don't have it on me right here. But there are aspects where anytime that you can crowd control an enemy, you will be gaining, you know, essence, a certain amount of essence back. Something like, you know, what we were utilizing with Corpse Tendrils, constantly pulling everything in. That's a crowd control moment. A lot of essence could come back from that. But at the same time, I feel like Shattered Spirit's doing everything that I needed to right now. You know, it's one of those that you could possibly trade out and have a little bit of a, you know, switch up to possibly increase your overall Bone Spirit damage just a little bit. But it's up to you. One thing that I have thought about is possibly taking Grasping Veins and putting it onto the necklace, and then throwing the Serration onto the ring itself, because I could have basically getting to the point where I'm 100% critical strike chance. Right now, I believe I'm somewhere in the 90 range with everything that I have available to me right now. And there are moments where, goodness, I hate it when I have that moment when Bone Spirit doesn't critically strike and I have that 10-second cooldown. It can be painful, but luckily with the build we have so much survivability it doesn't even matter. And there is a connection loss right there, I guess, from me sitting here too long. But effectively, I could be getting a bit more critical strike damage out of it. Oh wow, the whole game just crashed. Well, that's interesting. But effectively, I could be getting more critical strike damage and critical strike chance out of that, and it would be a bit more beneficial for me. But that being said, we need to move on to getting to the point where we understand whether or not... Oh, no. We need to talk about the helmet first. So give me a moment. Let me load this back up. Well, before Blizzard rudely interrupted me for quite some time, one thing that I was going to talk about was with the helmet, with the legendary aspect on this. This is also something you could trade out if you didn't really want, or if you didn't feel like the consuming corpses was actually being very beneficial for you. You could arguably trade this out for something for a bit more survivability, such as the Might, the Juggernaut, or Disobedience. Any one of those three would be a great addition just to give you a bit more survivability, especially if you're pushing into 90+ tier Nightmare dungeons. You're going to be a little bit squishy in those moments. We're going to have all the damage we need to blow through that, but survivability can be a little bit tough if you don't constantly have blood orbs, constantly getting that temerity working through, and something like one of these three different aspects just giving us a bit more survivability can mean the difference into pushing into that, you know, tier 100 layer of Nightmare dungeons or Nightmare vaults. With that being said, we've basically covered the gear all together. While you're leveling, when it comes to gloves, you don't even need Edge Masters. Edge Masters is just something that I really just kind of ran with. One thing that I forgot to say is when it came to Swelling Curse, Grasping Veins, Shattered Spirit, I think Serration as well. These are the only ones that I needed to make it into tier 4. The rest of my legendary aspects were pretty much a hodgepodge of things that just gave me survivability, that gave me a little bit more of damage reduction or armor. These 3 are things that you can craft from the occultist, so if you're looking to level with the Necro and looking to level with this build, those 3 at the bare minimum rolls were all I needed to make it through the tier 4 capstone and into tier 4, and I had plenty of damage. The only irritating part was the fact that there were moments where Bone Spirit wouldn't critically strike, but at the end of the road, it still didn't matter. I was still capable of surviving out those 10 seconds and then getting another critical strike in and being able to just push through that capstone dungeon and the capstone boss fairly easily. Now, he did have some one-shot capabilities, considering I came in there fairly early with gear that wasn't up to par. I didn't even have full sacreds on by that point. But luckily enough, I had all the damage I needed to just basically eviscerate him really quickly with just even the lowest rolls on these from the occultist imprinting. So if you need to level this, don't even worry about it. Those 3 are pretty much the only ones you need. And I even think I had this aspect on the gloves instead of a 2-handed sword at that time, but I can't remember right now. But that's all you really need. Now let's jump into the skill tree. All right, with the skill tree, we're going to start off with Bone Splinters. Obviously, Bone Splinters is going to be another one of those ways that we can increase our overall chance to critically strike, and I'm going to keep it that way for pretty much the duration of the rest of the build. By a certain point, when you feel like you're close enough to that 100% critical strike chance moment, you know, you may want to possibly change this over into the Initiate's Bone Splinter if you want that 20% chance to possibly get vulnerable on certain enemies for 2 seconds. I can't say that it's going to be something that works against you, but I can't say that it's going to be all that beneficial at the same time, considering there's going to be moments where that Bone Spirit's going to take a moment to travel to that enemy. It will be slow at first, but once it gets within a certain proximity radius, it'll speed up and immediately hit the target. But in certain instances, especially if you're a good distance away, it may take that Bone Spirit longer to get to that target than 2 seconds. But in that same moment, I mean, I guess if you just cast the Bone Spirit and then you started splintering, you may end up getting that win off that. But moving on from that point, we've got the Unliving Energy next and Hewed Flesh. We want 3 points into each of these, and we don't want any points in Imperfectly Balanced. You know, once you've gotten to the point where you're past 35 or level 40 and you've moved to just focusing on Bone Spirit itself, effectively once you've already gotten Ossified Essence to key passive, you're pretty much ready to go into just Bone Spirit by itself. You won't need Imperfectly Balanced. Sadly enough, it's not a core skill. I wish it was. I wish there was some legendary aspect to make it a core skill. It'd actually be another one of those tactics where we could end up getting overpowered damage with this and a few other things through some other uniques. It would be pretty nice, but add a little bit more damage through this. But at the same time, I don't see that coming in the future. I'd really like that as a future legendary aspect, to possibly change this up a bit and give it a bit more damage. But for the time being, Unliving Energy just giving us maximum essence to further increase the damage from that Bone Spirit, and Hewed Flesh to give us the chance to spawn in one of those corpses when we're at boss fights or in some of those other moments when we just haven't been able to kill just that quickly. And here we go again. I forgot where it was, but I believe I was at Hewed Flesh. Well, Hewed Flesh, you know, it's just another one of those moments where we're just spawning in some of those corpses, and any time that we don't have the capability of just having it available immediately, you know, Blood Mist or something else has gotten cooldown. The number one thing is just to have one corpse at least to be able to cast corpse tendrils while we're in the boss fight, and at the same time just giving us the capability of some of those corpses to consume past that point to just gain a little bit of essence, but at the same time just further increase our overall damage output. Moving on, we've got Blood Mist. Obviously, we'll want to make this all the way to Ghastly Blood Mist. That way we can create corpses anytime that we go into Blood Mist, and it's our only get out of jail free card. Sadly enough, you know, mobility isn't the strongest, and Blood Mist, even in some cases, is just not fast enough to create that invincible survivability, but in other cases, it can be the most life-saving thing. Now, I do have Skeletal Warriors with this build. As Skeletal Warriors Mastery, I just further increasing their overall survivability. They're really just something to take aggro, and in some of these boss fights and in some of these dungeons when you're facing off with certain enemies, especially at the end of vaults, they can be taking quite a bit of aggro right there, and they can take quite a bit of damage, especially if you have the defenders. We'll get to the Book of the Dead here in a second. But if you're not somebody that wants to roll with the Skeletal Warriors, you know, while leveling, I had Skeletal Mages and Skeletal Warriors, but I cast the Skeletal Mages off because I can get a maximum essence increase, and I didn't feel like I was getting too much of a benefit from just sacrificing the Skeletal Warriors. But if you'd like to, you can take this off. So the big reason I'm using the Skeletal Warriors is not only for the aggro they take, but at the same time, it's another way for me to consume corpses. Now, if you're not going to use the Skeletal Mages or the Skeletal Warriors, you should be ending up using Corpse Explosion. I feel like the Skeletal Warriors are more beneficial for me than Corpse Explosion, as if I'm just popping Corpse Explosion, I'm not doing a whole lot of damage with it, and sometimes in certain cases it's not even hitting anything. I'm generally just using it to consume a corpse for Fueled by Death, whereas the Skeletal Warriors are actively causing something to happen. They're constantly aggroing something, and even against Duriel, they actually keep aggro off of me and make it to where I have a little bit of breathing room in certain situations to just be able to kind of move around some of the dangerous things and be able to just deal as much damage as possible effectively. But coming up next, we've got Bone Prison, and we are going to be working with the Ghastly Bone Prison, as this is going to be another method for us to gain essence back, especially right after casting that Corpse Tendril, pull everything in, and then drop Bone Prison on top of that. You know, in dungeons, there's a large pack right there. We're going to get a ton of essence back on that. And at the same time, everything inside of Bone Prison is going to be vulnerable, and Bone Prison is even more valuable now that everybody can move through it, even your minions. It is extremely powerful. I would highly suggest using it on pretty much any bone build right now for that vulnerability and that essence regain. It's really strong, and in certain instances, especially at the end of those vaults, inside of that last little box room where they just throw everything right on top of you, sometimes when you're in that corner where there's no traps, you throw Bone Prison on yourself, it can give you a little bit more survivability. It's quite nice, and at the same time, since you don't get stuck in it, you have the free will to be able to just move in and out and give yourself some breathing room. Now on top of that, we want Grim Harvest, and we want Fueled by Death. But effectively for a little bit more essence regain, but at the same time, the big thing is just that 9% overall multiplicative damage increase. Going down from there, we've got Death's Embrace, giving us a little bit of that damage reduction from close enemies, but a little bit more damage in certain cases. The big thing is the damage reduction, though, from close enemies. Anything that's coming up to melee us, you know, we're taking a little bit of that chunk of damage away from them. And then 3 points into Death's Reach. That way, there are certain instances where, you know, we're running out away from boss units, or we're running away from certain enemies. You know, we've locked on target with that homing missile for the Spirit Nuke. It's getting sent out, and we're getting that 12% multiplicative damage on top of that. Now, moving down, obviously, we want Corpse Tendrils, and this is one that changes up once we get Blood Artisans. You know, obviously, before you have the Blood Artisans, you want the Plagued Corpse Tendrils. That way, you're creating vulnerability on the enemies that are pulled in from the Corpse Tendrils. But after the point of Blood Artisans, we need to move over to Blighted Corpse Tendrils. That way, we have a chance for Blood Orbs to spawn anytime that they damage an enemy. Once they grab onto them, and trust me, there's going to be instances where you've got a large pack, you know, it's got an infinite reach to how many enemies it can pull in as long as they're within the radius. You could sometimes have them be, or have up to pretty much like 20 blood orbs spawn from just one pull of this. And especially during Duriel fights, you got all those maggots come down. If you're able to get one of those off in that moment, that's a ton of blood orbs right there. Free damage increase, free health back, and free increase to bone spirits you're able to cast during that fight. Sometimes that can really be the differential factor of increasing your TTK when it comes to just taking down Duriel. That damage increase is massive at the same point. But after Blood Artisans, once you've got that, you want the Blighted Corpse Tendrils. Now, moving on to Bone Spirit. This is one where obviously we want the enhanced Bone Spirit, but the choice between Ghastly Bone Spirit and Dreadful Bone Spirit is where you're going to differentiate once effectively while you're leveling, before you have pretty much 80 to 90% critical strike chance by itself. You want Ghastly Bone Spirit just to further increase your capability of constantly getting that critical strike, because you're going to need it early on, especially before Blood Artisan. You really want to make sure that you're maximizing the opportunity to have as many Bone Spirits and as high as a damage with that Bone Spirit. Because when it doesn't crit, it certainly does still do a lot of damage, but if you're facing off with elites or a boss unit, it really just kind of hinders you, and then you're stuck on a 10-second cooldown. So increasing your overall critical strike chance in those moments is just going to give you that bit of efficiency you really need. But by the time that you have 80 to 90% critical strike chance, you want to move over to Dreadful Bone Spirit, as this is going to give us 30% of our maximum essence back over the next 4 seconds after that Bone Spirit hits an enemy. A massive increase. Like, that's 30% of our total maximum essence, even after it hits enemies. So since it's after it hits the enemies, since we have that new legendary aspect that further increases our maximum essence by 2, if you hit like a large pack, boom, you're getting that 30% of that new maximum essence, and that's going to be huge at giving us every bit of the essence we need for that next 2-second cooldown right after, ready to go with that Bone Spirit, hitting millions of damage right after. But right after that, we've got 3 points into Serration, giving us the critical strike chance for each 30 essence you have upon cast. We've got the Compound Fracture, just giving us the capability of having a 15% increased damage after 10 times we've critically strike with the Bone Spirit. And at the same time, since we're using Bone Splinters, they are going to be critically striking quite often, so you can actually kind of work an angle into that method sometimes to get this to the point where it's already got that 15% ready to go once you're able to cast Bone Spirit. On top of that, Evolution, giving us the capability of 15% increased multiplicative damage towards any vulnerable enemies we have inside of Bone Prison. And I put in Rapid Ossification just to give us a cooldown reduction on Bone Prison. That way we can constantly keep having that up to gain that vulnerability and regain essence at the same time, just giving us a bit more efficiency while moving through dungeons or even in the middle of a boss fight. Going down from there, we've got Standalone. We may have Skeletal Warriors on us right now, but if you're one of those people that just doesn't end up wanting the Skeletal Warriors, moving over to Corpse Explosion, this is going to be a bit more of that damage reduction. And in certain cases, like a fight with Malphus, where I would highly suggest, yeah, moving to the Corpse Explosion and getting that maximum damage reduction, it can be beneficial, but we're also still getting a little bit of that damage reduction from this, even though we have 4 of those Skeletal Warriors out. But the big thing is having Memento Mori. That way we're further increasing the overall sacrifice bonus of the maximum essence from the mages and the critical strike damage from the golem. And cherry on top, obviously ossified essence to make sure that we have that maximum damage increase from our current essence pool, which right now is going to be 67.5, which could be a little bit higher. I could probably have it at 70% if I had that roll a little bit higher on my helmet. I tried Bone Storm in the beginning with leveling, but I found that over time it just had too long of a cooldown, even though we are spending, you know, over 100 essence all the time, sometimes even like 200 essence per Bone Spirit. It's just not enough to reduce the massive cooldown we have on Bone Storm. And Bone Storm, even for the short time duration that it's up, just isn't as beneficial as something like Blood Mist or possibly Corpse Explosion / Skeletal Warriors, or just spawning in Ray's Skeleton. Effectively, that's where it's landed. Now let's look at the Book of the Dead real quick. Skeletal Warriors, that's what I've got running right now. Every 6 seconds, your skeletal defenders basically can take direct damage without taking direct damage. This is one that I would say if I wanted to sacrifice Skeletal Warriors, I would probably end up going with the defenders. That way I can get a 20% increase to resistance to all elements, because by the time that you're at the point where you pretty much got 100% critical strike chance, that skeletal or the skirmisher's increase of 5% critical strike chance isn't actually going to be that beneficial to you. It's just basically overkill at that point, or basically going into that table of like, this is more than you possibly need. Whereas having that 20% increase to resistances to all elements is one of those moments that creates the opportunity for you to have less pieces of gear that need that role of resistances, so you can replace it with something like damage reduction while fortified, damage reduction, total armor percentage, increases to intelligence, movement speed. The list goes on any number of different attributes that could be replaced instead of needing more resistance to all, and getting you closer to that, maximizing your total resistances to each one of these elements. Now, that being said, Skeletal Mages, obviously Shadow for 15 increase to maximum essence, and on Golem, obviously we want the Iron one for the 30% multiplicative critical strike damage. Now, let's move into the Paragon boards. Now, when it comes to the Paragon board, going forward from the starting point, I went over to the right, got the prime 20% increase to damage, headed up, and right now I have the Glyph Socket Blood Drinker in here. I did have the Essence one in here beforehand while I was leveling just to get that critical strike damage, and I utilized that in the early portions of my leveling just to gain a bit more of that overall damage. This is something that's just going to give me, you know, a little bit more synergy with my Blood Orbs, giving me a bit more survivability by gaining Fortify. But from this point, I was able to move over to the left and the right. I went directly over to the left, considering I needed that 20% damage, but you also want that 200 armor, and then moved on to the first Paragon board, which is going to be that of the Bone Graft Legendary node. Immediately, I went over to the left, grabbed this one first. That way I could further increase my maximum essence and damage, and at the same time giving me more critical strike chance with the Bone skills, helping me early on with that Bone Spirit guaranteeing those critical strikes. Now, from that point, I did not go left just yet. I went all the way to the right and made sure that I got the critical strike damage with bone skills and more bone skill damage. Immediately went to the left, gained the reinvigorate, where we got more maximum essence and essence on kill, further increasing, you know, essence and essence regeneration, and then headed over to the right to make sure that I got that 20% bone skill damage. By this point, I think I grabbed this node up, but I didn't really have anything that was too important. Early on when I was leveling, the nodes or the glyph sockets did not matter. Honestly, this was about the only one that I put in that is probably noticeable. The nodes themselves within these Paragon boards are really going to be the thing that carries us to the point, and everything else is just going to be a little bit added on top for just fleshing out the damage even more. But from the point of hitting this 20% damage skill, I don't think I even went for this node just yet. I might have just pushed over a little bit, but I came back down here, went over to the left, and then made it over to our second Paragon board with the Scent of Death. Something that's basically a win-win situation, as this is going to give us either 15% damage reduction with no corpses nearby, or with corpses nearby and 15% increase of damage if there's no corpses nearby. You can't go wrong with this one. It's damage up or, you know, taking damage less. But as well, on this board, we have damage to healthy and critical strike damage as well. Over here on the left, I went straight down, went and grabbed this over here on the right, the Scent of Death, and then went straight up over to our right for more critical strike damage. Now, I went over to my left, and I did not go down and to the left just yet. I did not grab this portion. I immediately went up and over to our next Paragon board, because by this time, I ended up having the Blood Artisan, so now I'm trying to synergize a little bit more with those blood orbs that we're gaining for the free Bone Spirit. So I went for Blood Begets Blood. That way, each time that I'm grabbing one of those blood orbs, I'm further increasing my overall damage and not just increasing my overall survivability and just casting more of those Bone Spirits. Which, this is going to benefit us in the long run, considering this is one of those moments where if you've got like 5 blood orbs right there and you're about to cast that Bone Spirit, or that free one from that, you're gaining another 15% multiplicative damage from those moments. So it's just another one of those synergy moments, gaining a little bit more damage out of those free casts that we get. But I went up over to the left, gained the 90% overpowered damage, specifically more just to have the 10%, as I just didn't feel like potion healing or life regeneration while not being damaged was going to be worth my time. And then I went straight up and over to the right. And then from that point, went over to my left, grabbed up the 10% damage for 4 seconds after picking up a blood orb. And the big thing about this one was the 12% damage while healthy. That's just going to be a bit of a benefit, and a bit more of that damage while healthy over here. I didn't grab the last node over here. I just didn't feel like it was going to be necessary. I could probably, arguably, I might want to take this off and possibly put that somewhere else. But these are little minute differences that we could just kind of work in. But from that point, I went up and over to the left, and then went over into the Flesh Eater. Now, this is something that I thought was basically the last thing that I needed for this build. I wasn't even certain that it was going to be like the greatest benefit to me. You know, some people arguably, I mean, if you didn't have the Blood Artisan by like pushing into the next Paragon tree and you weren't sure when you were going to get it or when you were going to start farming Grigor for it, if you even needed it at that point, you know, you could arguably just go for Flesh Eater straight off the bat, considering it's guaranteed to give you more damage in that moment, and then later on you can kind of refund and rework it if that's where you're at. But with Flesh Eater, you know, it's one of those moments that it's stagnant. Say at the beginning of a boss fight, you know, you consume 3 corpses, you know, you hit Blood Mist, go around the boss, drop those 3 corpses, consume those corpses, and hit corpse tendrils to get that added damage. And then later you see 2 more of those corpses, line that up with, you know, another corpse tendrils, consume those, and then cast Bone Spear to get that 40% multiplicative. It can work out in situations like that to be a nice little hefty chunk of increased damage output. But from that point, after grabbing that, I went up and over to the left. We're going for the targeted. That way we're getting just increased the damage to elites. And I did grab the socket over here for the glyph corporeal. Now, I still don't even have... I have to level this one up just to get the last 5 intelligence, just to have that additional 10% physical damage. That's just something that's going to be another one of those little slivers of increase of damage that might be noticeable, but it may just be something that's like, hey, here's another 500,000 or a million. You know, we're already dealing so much damage at this point that another 500,000 or a million isn't going to be the biggest difference. And here we go again with this thing DCing me. It's a nightmare. And we're back again after, I guess, Blizzard just having some issues. Diablo. So anyways, like I was saying, with the corporeal, it's just a little bit of additional damage, but then from that point, I moved over back to the Scent of Death board and started working my way down. That way I could just get another one of these glyph sockets to give me a little bit more damage while fortified and damage reduction while I was fortified down here, as well as a little bit more of that armor. I did end up grabbing the damage to injured enemies as well, just giving us a little bit more of that DPS in the long run, as well as 10% or 10 intelligence. 10% intelligence would be really nice on some of these Paragon boards. You know, I think that would probably be a really good glyph if that could be out there. You know, there's a lot of different things they could add to the game, but that's going to be the Paragon board right there, people. That's the full build of it. Now, let's jump into some gameplay and showcase how to utilize the play, or the build itself. Now, before we jump into the gameplay, one thing that I did forget to actually talk about, which is the Schnitzel Lap Crab, our little Seneschal construct over here. Now, what I've got this placed with is Reconstruct, which is going to basically give us some healing. I've done duration support with that to just give it a bit more duration when it comes to healing me. On top of that, we've got initiative support, which causes the Seneschal, or Schnitzel Lap Crab. Schnitzel Lap Crab just rolls off the tongue a little bit better than Seneschal. But, yeah, it teleports to me. That way it's on its job getting me healed as it just kind of goes off on its own. And then this decreases its cooldown, which gives it, you know, a little bit faster. And over here, though, Tempest is actually really good for one very specific reason, which is we can gain primary resource from this. This is going to be another way that we'll be able to gain that primary resource for gaining the maximum amount towards that next Spirit Nuke. And on top of that, we've got Fortify support, giving us a little bit of Fortify every time that it's striking with this. And on top of that, Arcing support makes it hit multiple enemies, which is gaining us even more of that primary resource back. But that's going to be the Schnitzel Lap Crab right there, pretty much talked about in any way. And I didn't even use the Tempest up until I got to the very end. I didn't even realize how powerful it was. You know, it was basically not until I was about level 90 plus that I ended up using the Tempest. Before this, I ended up using, I can't remember if it was, I think it was Protect, where I just gained a barrier. Pretty much anything that was basically giving me a little bit more protection was what I was using with the Lap Crab, but that's going to be about it. But let's jump into that gameplay and showcase how to utilize this build. Now, I've chose a Nightmare Vault Dungeon, whatever you'd like to call it, as the way to showcase how to utilize these skills and the playstyle of this build, as it's just going to be something that's a bit quicker than, you know, possibly just going through a full-on Nightmare Dungeon. Sometimes these can be just, as soon as we basically go through this gate, the very ending portion of just getting to the final room of this vault is very simple, and trust me, the build's very simple to utilize. There's not a whole lot of complication with this build. A lot of it is just based around you constantly moving, casting these bone spirits. And we're here at tier 74, as within this tier, even from like tier 70 going forward with the nightmare dungeons, you have the possibility, or the higher possibility, and a lot of times 900 to 925 item power from these. So these can be a little bit more casual and easier to go through to get that 925 gear before pushing on into the higher tiers, as pretty much 70 plus on the tiers, you really walk into a lot of different scenarios where there's plenty of things that are dealing so much damage that it could one-shot you. It could end up in one of those moments where you have anything that's below maximum resistance. You know, it's that dangerous. But let's just get into the vault itself and then showcase the playstyle. But the first thing that we're going to do every time there's pretty much enemies right out the gate, we're going to send in one of those bone spirits, which took a little bit longer than it should have, but then pull everything in and start nuking it all out. Got a couple of free ones right here, try to avoid those death pulses, and they just constantly be able to keep utilizing bone spirit against some of the riffraff if we don't have any more blood orbs. But at the same time, I usually utilize bone prison anytime that I see something like elites in the next room. Like, the number one thing I really want to do is make sure that I have that available for elites, so that way we can get that vulnerable on them. The rest of the time that I may use it is just for survivability purposes. If there's too much in the next room where I need a little bit of protection, maybe corpse tendrils is on cooldown, you know, any number of things could go wrong, and sometimes we can utilize bone prison as a little bit more of a survivability one. But you'll notice we're able to come into pretty much each room and just keep nuking it out. Didn't get any pearls of warding, forgot about that. It's not going to be the biggest problem. Pretty much don't need anything into this anyways. But now this is one of those moments, corpse tendrils on cooldown. I didn't realize there was an elite pack in there. We may need to just automatically go into Blood Mist, create some of those corpses, pull everything in. Watch out for those death pulses right there. Goodness, some of these can be dangerous zones right here. But you notice right there, kind of utilize that. I'm kind of stuck in a prickly situation here, so I'm kind of having to act on the fly. But each time, the bone spirit's ready to go, pretty much. I haven't had a miss on critical strikes thus far, thankfully. But even if I did, we have a couple of skills to kind of get out of jail free, kind of give us some leeway, and make sure that you have some dashes available. And sometimes you'll have that U-turn going on. That's why I typically kind of run out. I let the Skeletal Warriors kind of take the aggro, give myself some time to kind of group everything together and make sure I'm avoiding damage while we're in those moments where Corpse Tendrils hasn't pulled everything in just yet. That way I can line everything up perfectly. And in cases like that, you know, I just had a free one cast, I didn't even realize that, and now I'm stuck on cooldown. Sometimes that's going to happen, but luckily it's only 10 seconds. By the time we're in the next room, we're already ready to go. Should see a couple of enemies coming up here soon. Haven't had anything drop thus far, though. Kind of a weak dungeon. I guess let's showcase from this chest how we can possibly get some 925 gear. Hopefully. And 914, 906, even that's 868. Not always is it going to be 925 guaranteed, but you're going to find a lot of times the legendaries especially are going to be 925. But anything in that 900 range is going to be a benefit for you pushing towards that 100 tier. But you notice just constant nukes going. Alright, let's keep it moving. Let's get that Corpse Tendrils pulling everything in. We've got an elite pack right here and just blowing everything up. It's over. Dropping it. Ah, great, some Ancestral Boots. I was really hoping that was something else that was going to be unique, honestly. But you notice we don't know what's in that next room. Let's see what these dropped as. Yeah, another 925 right there. And 925. It's pretty much past that tier 70 mark. You got that guaranteed possibility of 925 starting to drop, so you can get some of that pinnacle gear going. But you notice it's fairly casual with this build, and we're able to just kind of like roll through each room, kind of moving in circles, making sure we're avoiding the majority of damage, and not really getting close to death in too many situations. As long as we kind of like keep our distance, we're going to maintain a pretty healthy level of health. You'll notice though, anytime they start to get close, it can be a little bit dangerous. But for the most part, we've got those skeletal warriors keeping the distance. We're able to just nuke anything close to us, pull everything back, drop another nuke. Keep consuming those corpses, getting the skeletal warriors up, and maintaining their health in these certain moments. They will die pretty quickly to certain enemies. But we got another one of those moments. Pull everything in. Just keep nuking. And gotta, you know, Death Pulse is pretty much slowing me down right now. Probably one of the #1 things, kind of keep having to do that circle pilot moment. Now, Barrier is definitely one of the most dangerous things to face off with. That thing can make sure that, you know, some of these elites don't take the one-shot damage. We're gonna just quickly blood mist out of that real quick. So that's getting pretty dangerous. Consume a couple of corpses, and then, ooh, yeah. I got a little bit dangerous right there. I bum rushed straight into that Death Pulse. But let's check out some of this gear, see if anything's 925. Yep, 925, 904. Looking pretty good so far on the drops. That's just at tier 74. This can happen at tier 71 as well if you want to just drop it down, you know, have a little bit less of a dangerous time. And that's one thing to key highlight. I just had one of those moments where I was on cooldown for Bone Spirit, but I was lucky enough to be able to cast a Bone Spirit that critically striked from the Blood Orbs, and that immediately decreased the cooldown because it dropped that 7 seconds. It was at 6 seconds, but we were immediately capable of coming back to that full-on cooldown off of that from the free Bone Spirit. So that's the nice part about Blood Artisans, is that not only it can be one of those moments where it's a free Bone Spirit, but it can bring us off of cooldown from our own Bone Spirit. So we just keep nuking. You may be noticing that, you know, we'll see from like 500,000, 1 million, sometimes 10 million in certain situations. It really does range with the amount of damage we'll be dealing with the Bone Spirit. But pretty much, oh no, what's going on right here? Don't tell me I'm just like lagged out. There's no way. Oh, this is horrible. Come on now. There's no way. That's ridiculous. I mean, all night tonight. Like, I'm trying to make this video all night. I mean, it's unbelievable. I can't stand this. Again, we've got another just DC moment. Goodness. I mean, I guess that's good enough right there. Maybe. You know what? I've had more than 10 DCs tonight just trying to make this video. I'm going to be real. It's cut me off so many different times. Sometimes when I'm in the middle of talking, it's pretty much absurd at this point. But I think that's basically showcased the build enough for you. You've seen how powerful it can be. Sadly enough, we didn't get to finish that vault, but I mean, it's clearing through 70s. You can go into 90s. You're just going to have to kind of tiptoe a little bit more. You know, you're going to want to have that 925 gear. You're going to have the capability of destroying everything in there. But it is going to be one of those moments where you're just going to have to be on your toes when it comes to those higher tiers. Apparently, there's a problem logging in. I mean, this is I don't know what they've done. They had an update today. You know, it's now the 2nd of February. I started filming this before it was the 2nd of February. And I just keep having issues like this. Well, guys, that's going to be the Spirit Nuke build. Hopefully Diablo starts or stops acting up for me so I can get on to the next couple of builds I'd like to make for the Necro. But hopefully you've enjoyed this. Hopefully this is another one of those builds you can play around with. The Spirit Nuke is just a good bit of fun, and I've had tons of fun with it since I haven't played Diablo 4 since the first season launched. You know, I skipped over Season 2, and Season 3, I've noticed a lot of people aren't enjoying it all that much, and yeah, the vaults aren't really, you know, the whole craze. One thing that I forgot to talk about was the construct. Goodness, so I'm going to have to interject some footage here, or I'll probably have to interject it somewhere before we get into the gameplay footage. I'll probably have already put that in and already explained this. But hopefully you've enjoyed this. Hopefully this is another build you can throw in for your Necro that's going to be able to get you through those Duriel runs. It's going to make it a whole lot easier. You're going to be pumping out damage. It's going to be a fun time. You know, just nuking everything. and just pushing through efficiently. The only thing slowing you down is some of these Nightmare Vault modifications, just having to double back and not get hit by those. But hopefully you've enjoyed this. And if you'd like to see some of this or more of this content, hit that subscribe button. I have a few Necro builds that I want to get done before I start moving on to Helldivers next month, or this month actually, now that we're in February 8th, that's coming up. And at the same time, I'm going to be pushing into Sorcerer, kind of playing around with that. And if you'd like to see some of this content live, hit that link down in the description below. Follow me over at Twitch. I'm streaming daily. We'll be on Diablo 4 daily up until February 8th when Helldivers drops. And we'll be checking out that Lunar event and also the Gauntlet later on. So be ready to check out some of that. But on that note, guys, have a good one.